So this section is a short review of some of the disorders that can happen in the brain. We're going to talk about some developmental disorders, some affective disorders, but we'll talk first with just what happens when there are tumors in the brain. Now, a tumor is just sort of cells that replicate very rapidly and create space in the brain, pushing other parts of the brain out or destroying other parts of the brain. They really hurt the brain by just kind of taking up space. So let's look at a few different types of tumors. So we have a mass of uncontrolled cells. Now, if the tumor is malignant, then the clump of cells doesn't have a distinctive border. And what can happen is those cells, those cancerous cells that replicate really rapidly, can metastasize. A metastasize means that they go into the bloodstream and they end up in other parts of the body where they grow rapidly. So, and that can be extremely dangerous, if not deadly. A benign tumor, however, can still be very, very harmful, but it can be either removed, but it is not releasing these fast replicating cells into the rest of the body. It is simply just growing. And if it starts taking over different parts of the brain, that's a lot of problems. And if those tumors are really deep in the brain stem or near the hypothalamus, they're very hard to get to. So here are some types of tumors. There's a glioma, and remember that neurons don't replicate or replicate very little. So it's typically not a neuron that is causing the rapid replication. It's usually a glial cell, an astrocyte, an oligodendrocyte, and so these make up a large portion of the tumors. Another is the meningioma, which is rapidly reproducing cells, replicating cells in the meninges, and those are on the surface of the brain and also can be very dangerous. So you can see here this very large tumor being developed and really pushing into the brain and taking over the frontal lobe and destroying the cells in the frontal lobe. So let's talk about some inherited metabolic disorders. And there are a lot of different types of these disorders, and this is usually where somebody lacks a gene or has an extra gene that keeps them from creating certain types of enzymes. Enzymes are proteins. They don't have the DNA to make that protein, and so the brain isn't metabolizing certain types of chemicals, isn't creating certain types of chemicals, and that can be very disruptive in terms of development. I'm going to give you just one example. It's a very interesting example because it has a really fascinating history. This disorder is called phenylketonuria, PKU, phenylketonuria. Now, what was noticed that a lot of people who were in mental institutions, severely mentally disabled, a doctor noticed that these people also had unusual smelling urine. Okay, I'm not sure how you determine that, but this is what this doctor determined. And so he thought maybe these individuals have a metabolic disorder because they are producing too many of this type of chemical called ketones in their urine, ketonuria. And it was discovered that these individuals lack a specific enzyme that helps to convert phenylalanine into tyrosine. They lack this enzyme to convert phenylalanine, which people get in their diets, you get this is in food, to tyrosine. Tyrosine is needed to convert to L-dopa, dopamine, norepinephrine, and some of the other catecholamines. This is a precursor to dopamine. So if this individual is, when they're born, they begin to eat phenylalanines because it's common in diet, and they have a buildup of phenylalanine, which tends to destroy the brain cells, and they don't have enough tyrosine, so they're not producing enough dopamine. This is a recessive disease. There's about 1 in 10,000. And right now, every child that's born in the United States gets tested for PKU, because even though their nature says that they can't convert phenylalanine to tyrosine, their nurture allows them to bypass that. What I mean by nurture is people with PKU are put on very strict diets. They can't have phenylalanine in their diet. Then they are given supplements of tyrosine, and we bypass this conversion, and they develop normally. So while 100 years ago, 50 years ago, these individuals with PKU would end up severely mentally disabled, institutionalized, now with this diet restriction, this testing, diet restriction, supplements, they can develop normally. It's a great story about solving a metabolic brain disorder. So autism is very complicated. I mean, it's very common. About 1 in 88 people are on the spectrum. Keep in mind that most of these disorders are spectrum disorders, everything from depression and schizophrenia, of course, autism, different levels. And it's a little bit more common in boys than girls, males than females, and usually begins to show symptoms at the age of 3. About 50% of those with autism are thought to be mentally disabled or have mental retardation. And there's a lot of symptoms that go into this, and it's usually a lot of social problems, a lot of repetitive movement problems, and there's a lot of questions about what causes them. Well, a big push back in the 90s was that autism, because it was growing, they thought it was linked to immunizations, and this article came out in a prestigious journal called The Lancet that showed a link between immunization and autism. Well, that was not a good study. It's been retracted, and there have been thousands, literally, of studies to show that autism and immunizations do not autism is not caused by immunizations, and yet still it's out there, and still we have celebrities and models coming out and saying this happens. This is a real dangerous thing, because we see an increase in cases of children dying from whooping cough and measles and all these things that kids aren't getting immunized for. We have this wonderful thing called immunizations, and they save kids from these terrible diseases, and then stupid people link it to immunizations. Why? Because kids get immunizations at age 3, and then they start showing symptoms at age 3 of autism. They do not cause each other. This is just things happening at the same time. And there's a lot of studies that show that immunization is not linked to autism. So we see a slightly larger brain by age 3, and that kind of evens out in adolescence. There's a lot of theories of what's going on here. There's a wiring theory. There's an idea that even though the brain is larger, the white matter and the connectivity of axons is underdeveloped in children on the autism spectrum. And then there's also the idea that in certain areas of the brain there's over-connectivity, over-dendritic branching, over-axonic branching, especially in the visual center. And the hyperconnectivity might be related to social impairments and oversensitivity to sounds and noises and things like this. I think we have a long way to go on what is causing autism. And there's probably environmental factors, there's probably genetic factors, there's a lot of things. So we need to keep up the research to try to understand this disorder without going down the pseudoscience route and stopping the vital immunization programs that we have in the United States. So what areas are involved? Well, the limbic system is involved, the cerebellum is involved, the frontal cortex is involved, all showing differences in children on the autism spectrum. But remember, the brain isn't just this is the spot. The brain is about how neurons connect with other neurons, and that seems to be the issue with autism. Let's talk about some degenerative disorders. This is where the brain might start off normal and healthy, but but begin to degenerate because of disease. So we'll talk about Huntington's, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's disease. So Huntington's disease, sometimes called Huntington's chorea. Chorea means dance. A choreographer, chorea. And that's because people who suffer from this in the later stages have very little control over muscle activity, and the body is basically dancing around, so to speak. Now, this is one of those disorders that is very much genetically determined, and you can't say that about many disorders. It's a lot of interaction between the environment and genes. This one is really strongly genetically determined. It's caused by an over-replication of a certain gene on the 4th chromosome. It's a dominant disorder. So if you have, remember there are 2 alleles for things like this. We have 2 alleles for traits, and if you have 2 recessive, a lot of disorders are recessive traits, 2 recessive. But if somebody is heterozygote, they have a dominant and a recessive, they get Huntington's disease. And it's not that common, about 8 in 100,000 people. But if you have that disease, it's gonna just start developing age 30, age 35, and so if your parent has it, let's say they're heterozygote, a dominant and a recessive, and your other parent doesn't, homozygote recessive, the chances of you getting it are 50-50. The chances of you getting that dominant allele is 50-50. And right now we can test for this. And so you might be developing very normally, everything is fine, no problems. And the question is, would you want to know if your parent has it? Would you want to know if you have it? And it causes, first it attacks the areas like the basal ganglia, which has to do with motor activity, but it eventually begins to get to other areas that have to do with cognition and dementia, finally death. Alzheimer's disease is a little bit more common. It happens to people as they get older, as the brain gets older, oftentimes. And we're still learning a great deal about what causes this. I think we're getting very close to creating cures for this. I'm hoping that by the time you reach your older years that you won't have to deal with Alzheimer's disease. It's a degenerative disease that first causes cells primarily in areas like the hippocampus that has to do with memory to degenerate, and the axons and the branching of the dendrites degenerate, and the cells die in these areas. And some of the causes is one is known as an amyloid plaque, and this is a plaque of this substance called beta amyloid, and also parts of the neuron begin to build up extracellularly. It's a hard word to say, extracellularly. And it starts to cause things like dendrites to die off and axonal branches to die off. And that complexity of those dendrites and those axon branches is really how memory is created. And so if those begin to prune back, begin to become less complicated, then we have the memory problems. So beta amyloid, it's a protein. It's found in excess of people with Alzheimer's disease. So amyloid plaque kind of builds up. You see these in the brain tissue. You see these plaques build up, and they just take over the space and begin to destroy, not only killing the cells, but first starting by killing the dendrites and the axons. Another thing that happens is you get inside the cell, not extracellular amyloid, but people with Alzheimer's have neurofibrillary tangles, and these begin to destroy and kill the cells from the inside. We have these two kinds of things, and there's been a lot of work on stopping these amyloid plaques and stopping these neurofibrillary tangles. But this is really a general cell death, and we begin to see these sulci increase in size, because basically the brain is shrinking. So here's kind of a normal brain. Here's a brain of somebody with Alzheimer's. You can see those deep fissures in there. and it really destroys memory. It destroys the ability to create new memories. They might retain old memories. It's very difficult and not a pleasant way of spending your last few years. Parkinson's disease also has some genetic components, as does Alzheimer's, as does, of course, Huntington's. And this is a degenerative disorder that is affecting dopamine cells from the substantia nigra up to the striatum, up into parts of the basal ganglia, and this is also affecting that motor activity. These are primarily the destruction of dopamine cells. This is known as the nigrostriatal system, from the substantia nigra up to the striatum, which is like the caudate nucleus. So if these cells begin to degenerate, then motor function tends to have some problems. And so you give somebody the precursor to dopamine. Try to facilitate the dopamine, get the dopamine working a little bit more. So you give them L-DOPA. And if you remember, tyrosine is converted to L-DOPA. L-DOPA passes the blood-brain barrier, gets into the brain, is converted in the cells to dopamine. So give them L-DOPA. Another word for that is levodopa. And that seems to alleviate the symptoms. However, for some people, you're adding dopamine. You're adding dopamine, and remember, dopamine has a lot to do with compulsive behaviors, addictive behaviors. And some people who take levodopa, not everybody, but about 8%, who were never addicted to gambling in the past, never had problems with addiction before, suddenly show this reaction, this side effect to levodopa, which is compulsive gambling. And people can really destroy their lives by not paying attention to that. So here's that nigrostriatal pathway. Here's the ventral tegmental area. Here is that substantia nigra moving up into the striatum. These are the cells that are destroyed in somebody with Parkinson's disease. What about some affective disorders, some mood disorders, emotional disorders? Let's go through a few of those. Well, schizophrenia is a very common disorder, also a spectrum disorder. Somebody with severe schizophrenia has terrible, terrible problems living in a society. Some others with minor symptoms, we may call them schizotypal. Sometimes they're just a little odd, a little weird, a little creative, maybe. Maybe thinking outside the box. I think I remember my professor saying that you would find people maybe schizotypal at Star Trek conventions or Comic-Cons and things like this. Well, this is not such a bad thing, but when you have that level, that spectrum, people at one end can be a terrible, terrible curse, a terrible mental disorder. We're also going to talk about some affective mood disorders, bipolar disorder, depression, things like that. So schizophrenia, it means split mind, but these aren't multiple personality problems. That's very, very uncommon. It's just somebody who's having a difficult time differentiate between reality and what's going on in the brain. And, imagine if you heard a voice that you didn't think came from your own brain talking to you. How do you ignore that? How do you not listen to that? That's a really terrible thing. And people with schizophrenia were, for a long time, were institutionalized. Some were given frontal lobotomies. It was terrible. We have medication now that helps to alleviate some of these symptoms. It's one of the most common mental illnesses. Remember Huntington's disease was 8 in 100,000. Well, this is about 1% of the population. That's a lot of people. People who are homeless are oftentimes on this spectrum of schizophrenia. Think about that when somebody is trying to ask you for money or begging on the street. They're probably suffering from a mental disorder. A little compassion. Men start showing the first signs in their 20s, sometimes in their late teens, women a little later. The U.S. spends a great deal of money caring for people with these disorders. Well, it's sometimes in schizophrenia we discriminate between positive symptoms and negative symptoms. And we're even starting to think that these might be different physiological parts of the brain. So a positive symptoms is probably what you think of when you think of schizophrenia. These are delusions, delusions of persecution, delusions of grandeur, hallucinations. Mostly hallucinations are auditory, hearing voices, but sometimes they're tactile, sometimes they're visual, sometimes they're olfactory. And then there's the negative symptoms, which is a difficult time with motivation. In other words, just can't do anything. Sometimes it's a catatonia, inability to sort of this flat, blunt affect. Blunt meaning very little emotion, very little activity. Loss of pleasure, that's called anhedonia. And oftentimes people with negative symptoms might be institutionalized and then just kind of sit and stare at a wall all day. It's really a terrible, terrible circumstance. Well, schizophrenia has environmental and genetic components like most disorders. So if you look at twin studies, monozygotic twins, monozygotic means they have the same genes, they came from the same zygote, same egg. And monozygotic twins have a very high concordance, about 30 to 50%. In other words, if one has schizophrenia, the other does as well. In dizygotic twins, meaning sharing the same womb but coming from different zygotes, different sperm and eggs, not identical. These are just normal siblings. It's still high, it's 17%. And adoptive studies, 13% of biological relatives of adoptees with schizophrenia have the disease. In other words, you can be raised in a whole different environment and still the concordance is rather high at 13%, much higher than just the normal population at 1%. So this is a graph showing general populations, 1%. But when you get up into parents and siblings and children, the percentage is increased by a lot. And of course, monozygotic twins is the highest. This shows a genetic influence, but not a genetic determinism. An absolute, you share the same genes, one gets it, the other one gets it for sure. That would be true for Huntington's disease. Again, just some showing schizophrenic, non-schizophrenic relationship between monozygotic and dizygotic twins. What causes schizophrenia? Well, there's some genetics that go into it. Family stress, poor social interaction, even early onset of viruses, brain trauma. These are all influences on the manifestation of schizophrenic symptoms. So here are some hypotheses. I'd like you to know two hypotheses, and they're kind of interconnected. The one that's been around the longest is what's known as the dopamine hypothesis. It is an overactivation of certain dopamine systems. Overactivation of certain dopamine systems. And these are oftentimes associated with the positive theories, positive symptoms of schizophrenia. So these different dopamine, overactivation of these different dopamine systems, and we'll talk about some remedies are drugs that reduce dopamine activity. A more recent theory is the idea of glutamate being involved in schizophrenia. Glutamate is one of the most common neurotransmitters in the brain. It's a common excitatory neurotransmitter. And the idea is that during early development, in adolescence, early adolescence, there might be an overactivation of certain glutamate cells, and overactivation of glutamate can cause cell death. Glutamate can overexcite neurons and cause them to die. The death of cells is called apoptosis, one of my favorite words. And so the idea is that in adolescence there's an overactivation of glutamate, but as adults we have what's called the hypofunctioning theory of schizophrenia. Hypo meaning less than, hyper meaning more, hypo. Underactivation of certain glutamate systems in adulthood lead to people with schizophrenia. So, for example, glutamate antagonists like PCP and ketamine drugs can produce positive schizophrenic-like symptoms. So things that affect glutamate, you can get schizophrenic-like symptoms. When you look at people post-mortem, you look at their brain, you find problems with glutamate receptors, NMDA receptors, in people with schizophrenia. You can also look at metabolites of glutamate are low in people with schizophrenia. So glutamate seems to be playing a role. So kind of as a summary, overactivity of dopamine systems may be causing positive symptoms, but in some cases, an underactivity of dopamine can cause the negative symptoms. So remember the positive and negative symptoms, it's not so straightforward. An overactivation of glutamate systems in development may cause cell death, apoptosis, which later can affect function, and an underactivity of glutamate when they get into their 20s can lead to both positive and negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So here's some of the drugs. Some of the early drugs were just trying to keep dopamine from being active. This is one of the first antipsychotic. When you hear words called antipsychotic or neuroleptic, these are drugs typically given to people to reduce schizophrenic symptoms. This is known as a typical antipsychotic as opposed to an atypical antipsychotic, which we'll get to. It's under the common name is Thorazine. You might have heard of Thorazine. Really knocks people out, and it is a dopamine antagonist, blocks dopamine. Primarily blocks dopamines at the D1, D2, D3, and D4 receptors. There are different types of receptors for dopamine, and this kind of blankets them. Can also affect serotonin receptors as well. Some side effects when you're blocking dopamine, when you're lowering dopamine activity generally in the brain, you're going to get Parkinsonian-like symptoms. In other words, the muscle tremors. Because remember, Parkinson's disease is an underactivity of dopamine in the nigrostriatal pathway. So you get what's called tardive dyskinesia, inability to move, or movement is not fluid. So these can be side effects. Drowsiness. So a lot of times people who are schizophrenic, it's a really terrible way to live, but sometimes the side effects of chlorpromazine is really bad too, in terms of getting up and getting your motivation and doing things. So typical antipsychotics like Thorazine and haloperidol is another example. Haldol is the common name. They're pretty effective in positive symptoms, the delusions and hallucinations, but they have a lot of side effects. Atypical antipsychotics like clozapine do not produce the same side effects and are a bit better at negative symptoms. They're more selective on blocking not D1, D2, but more D3 and D4 receptors. And that might reduce some of the symptoms. Also, some of these atypical antipsychotics might be affecting serotonin as well, might be affecting glutamate as well. So if you looked at just a coronal section in an X-ray, what you find is people with schizophrenia tend to have larger ventricles, lateral ventricles. It's not because the ventricles are growing and pushing anything. It's just that their cell death is a little bit more extreme in somebody with schizophrenia, probably during development, probably caused by glutamate. So that's one way of looking at some structural differences. You also see a loss of gray matter. Blue is a lot of gray matter. Red here is the loss of gray matter, certain types of gray matter, also in adolescents with schizophrenia. So there are some diagnostic tools, but typically they're behavioral. Okay, depression. Depression is something that is probably the most common disorder that you'll see. Different levels of depression, again, a spectrum. And, everybody goes through levels of depression. We've experienced levels of depression. A pet dies, or we break up with somebody, or a family member dies. These cause depression. These are acute depression states that last maybe several days or several weeks. but sometimes people get chronic depression and depression without cause. And so we get into things like major depression. And major depression is a very horrible thing to experience. And I remember I did a radio program, and I was interviewed about the brain, and it was a show on creativity in the brain, and they said, what about all these people with depression, and they're so creative, and all these great artists? And I was on there with another neuroscientist, and we were both like, no. Depression is not a good state. The rare case of somebody with depression having extra creativity is so rare. Depression is a state that you don't want to be into. It's an antithesis to creativity. Lack of enjoyment. Bipolar disorder is a waving between a depression state with little motivation, little activity, and a manic state with an overabundance of activity. And then there's just sort of depression and sort of the not otherwise specified. These are all kind of DSM-4 diagnosis. So one thing now, bipolar disorder, this is going, everything is great, everything is bad, the world is a great place, I'm going to get so much done, the world is a horrible place, I'm not going to get anything done. And people with bipolar disorder that go through these swings have very high cases of suicide. And suicide is a very common way for people to die, and it's a way to, if you are working in the field and helping people, it's a way to save people's lives. And again, causes of depression are genetic. We see these running in families. We look at, for example, if somebody commits suicide and they leave a note and they have severe depression, we also find that their relatives have a similar biochemistry, which we'll talk about in a second. And there are correlations with a lot of genetic activity. You can imagine this is not a monogenetic trait. This is a polygenetic trait, many genes. And it can also be triggered by anxiety disorder, by panic attacks, by post-traumatic stress disorder. These all go with depression. Learned helplessness and depression go hand in hand. The hypothesis for depression is known as the monoamine hypothesis of depression. And if you recall, the monoamines are things like serotonin is a monoamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine, dopamine. These are all monoamines. And the idea of depression is usually a low level of serotonin and norepinephrine, and even low levels of dopamine and epinephrine. So a lot of the remedies are to increase monoamine activity. So one way of doing that is to locate an enzyme, give a chemical that locates an enzyme. The enzyme is monoamine oxidase. It's an enzyme that breaks up monoamines. You don't want monoamines floating around all over your brain. These are neurotransmitters. You want to break them up, so you break them up with an enzyme, a monoamine oxidase enzyme. So if you have low level of serotonin or other monoamines, you give them a drug that is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. It blocks or destroys the monoamine oxidase, so there's more monoamine. And so monoamine oxidase inhibitors increase levels of serotonin and norepinephrine, epinephrine. There's a lot of side effects to monoamine oxidase inhibitors, and people have to be put on very strict diets. Well, I don't know if it's super strict, but you want to cut out a lot of things like certain types of nuts and red meats and red wines, because the monoamine oxidase inhibitors can inhibit the catabolism of dietary amines, and it can be actually very dangerous. People can die from eating the wrong food while on monoamine oxidase inhibitors. So cheeses and nuts and soys, we actually call this the cheese reaction, can produce hypertension. And the thing about antidepressants is a lot of times a doctor has to figure out what works for an individual. What works for one person might not work for another. So they might take a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and if that doesn't work, maybe a serotonin reuptake inhibitor or something like this. It's usually kind of the cocktail of what works. So maybe they work better on tricyclic antidepressants. This inhibits the reuptake of serotonin and norepinephrine, so there's more of it in the field, in the synapse. There's the specific serotonin reuptake inhibitors. These are very common today, SSRIs, such as Prozac, Celexa, Paxil. These are all selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. And again, it's a matter of the doctor and the patient figuring out which of these work. Another thing about these antidepressants is usually they take a long time to work. They take maybe a week or two, and this is the confusing part because they cause a reuptake. They're reuptake inhibitors, so there's more serotonin in the synapse very quickly. But the antidepressant nature of them usually takes several weeks. And there's also a lot of interest right now in who antidepressants work for. Somebody with very severe depression, they might work well along with therapy, but people with depression that comes and goes, or lighter depression, or depression that is because of a death in the family or something like this, might not be as good. Prozac. So, our nation, we take a lot of antidepressants. We take so many antidepressants that they're in our water system. Our fish have antidepressants in them. They become very popular in other countries as well. And there's a lot of commercials out there, but China and Japan take a lot of antidepressants. Antidepressants can work for bipolar disorder at times, but oftentimes people are just given lithium carbonate. Lithium carbonate just helps to mediate the high and low activity of certain types of neurotransmitters. It's kind of like a buffer. And a lot of people who have bipolar disorder respond well to lithium. And one of the more extreme measures that actually work, but only in extreme cases, if somebody has severe depression, suicidal depression, and this is chronic, electroconvulsive shock therapy, running electricity through the brain, can actually bring somebody out of that severe depression. It also can be a little dangerous. It also wipes out your memories, and you have problems with memories. But unlike an antidepressant, like a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, you can get a relief that is very, very quick instead of waiting 2 weeks. One of the things to think about with antidepressants is when somebody takes an antidepressant, they begin taking an antidepressant, sometimes they'll get worse. And they'll get worse for a week or so before they get better, and that's the time where we see the highest cases of, for example, suicide in teens who are on antidepressants. It's when they first start taking them. So that's something to be to consider for sure. Okay, that's it.